Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to start by welcoming everyone to the School of Kinesiology's Distinguished Speaker Series. I know many of you in the room, if not most, but I'm Andrea Bunden, an associate professor in our school and member of the Sociocultural Research Group. I want to start by acknowledging that we are gathered here today on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people. This is where I live, work, raise my family, sometimes play and recreate. And I want to express my gratitude to the stewards of this land. There's also a very long tradition of gathering on this peninsula to teach, to learn, to share, to build community, and it's a privilege to be able to continue that. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to introduce you to Dr. Danielle Piers. Dr. Piers is an associate professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology, Sport and Recreation at the University of Alberta. They hold a Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in Disability and Movement Cultures, and also serve as the university's academic lead for disability, cultures, and access. To say that Dr. Piers' work has been profoundly influential in the field would be an understatement, but would also probably prompt a pretty interesting conversation about what field we're talking about. I know Dr. Piers mostly from their work in disability sport, and specifically their research and their writing that brings a sociological lens to the study of disability sport, really critical and nuanced accounts of the history and politics of parasport and the implications for disabled people's access to and experiences in sport systems. But I'm also acutely aware that what I know of Dr. Piers' work is only one facet of what they do. And their work is deeply intersectional, often in support of queer community building alongside Indigenous scholars and leaders. And in other circles, they are maybe more known as a dancer, an award-winning filmmaker, a coach, and a Paralympian. As with many academic relations, I met Dr. Piers first through their writing and later in person. So I was a student here at UBC when I first came across a manuscript entitled Disempowering Paralympic Histories, Absent Athletes and Disabling Discourses. This, along with a few other things happening in my life at the time, was part of my own sociological awakening. A growing understanding that my experiences in sport were not everyone's experiences in sport, and that disabled people's experiences in sport are connected to much broader social issues and systems intersecting power systems. I can honestly say, after reading that paper, I never looked at sport quite the same way again. I met Danielle later in person that year at the North American Society for the Sociology of Sport conference, and my first thought was, a master's student wrote that? A deep sense of inadequacy. That was only confirmed when their next paper came out later that year, probably my favorite paper of all time, Interrogating Disability, the Decomposition of a Recovering Paralympian. If you're one of my students, you've read this paper. It's the paper I would take to, a desert island. Dr. Piers really invites you to look at something you thought you knew and to see it differently, but also not to see it just as it is, but to see what it could be. And that really affirmative and productive part of their work is something I find really, really compelling, really admirable. It's certainly, I think, something, or I know many of the things that Dr. Piers is going to talk about today, will prompt us to think about our own role. And by us, I mean people who study sport, participate in sport and movement practices and movement cultures more broadly, the role that we play in shaping more equitable futures and sport cultures where all bodies can thrive. Over the years, Dr. Piers and I have stayed in touch, usually online. Travel is difficult, sometimes dangerous, and many of the conferences that we attend are not accessible. I mean, the assumption is that kinesiologists study disability, not necessarily that disabled people are the scholars or are the person at the front of the classroom. But I'll say that even when not physically there, their presence is felt. Can't tell you how many conversations I've been in this past year alone, whether it's with a research team or grassroots sport organizers, where we've come to a really thorny problem and someone's go, I was talking to Danielle the other day. And that shifted our conversation entirely. So their intellectual evidence of their intellectual generosity is really everywhere. So it's with a lot of excitement that I welcome Dr. Piers here today. I know some of our students have been reading their work, much in the same way I did so many years ago. So it's a real pleasure to have them here speak more. I also just want to thank Dr. Jean-Sébastien, Dr. Rob Bouchel, our director, Angela Sebastian as our organizer of the speaker series for enabling this event to happen, and also Anita and Robert for their assistance with all the logistics and planning for today. I'll also remind you that we are going to have a bit of just coffee and cookies, probably out in the atrium afterwards, and any particular students and early career scholars, but really anyone who wants to join us for a more casual chat is invited to meet us out there. With that, Danielle, looking forward to this.
Thank you. That was literally the best, kindest introduction I've ever had. And now I feel like I match my shirt. Thank you, Andrea, and to everyone who made this possible. Thank you all for wearing a mask and for coming today. This is only my third, I think, in-person talk since COVID started 5 years ago. And so by coming and wearing a mask, you're allowing me to be part of community and in these conversations and also stay alive. So thank you. There's a slide on deck. It's got some ornate foliage on it, like all the slides. It reads, tenderly bumping elbows and stories, kinesthetic learnings towards mutual flourishing. I am currently seated in a wheelchair for those engaging, not primarily visually. I'm wearing a collared button-up shirt. I'm a slightly less pasty wet color than usual because of the beautiful sun out in Vancouver right now. I got short cropped hair, blue glasses. You can call me Danielle. You can call me Dr. Piers. My pronouns are they, them. Call me anything but Mrs. Piers and I'll be okay with it. There's a green box on the bottom of my slide. It'll be on the bottom of almost all slides and it'll offer a bit of a citational lineage. There'll be a link later for downloading them if you want to see who the collaborators are who I'm thinking with. I do almost no work alone, so anything I'm offering right now is the ideas that have emerged between many of us in conversation. So welcome. Invitations to bring your fullest self into the space. The following access tools are built in today. Copy of slides are available at this link, which is tinyurl.com/bigdp, small present PDF. There's captioning. Thank you, Andrea, for organizing that. I will offer descriptions of meaningful visuals. It is available online. We are hybrid right now, and it is being recorded, but we're not going to record the Q&A. There will be some offerings towards movement or towards internal practice. Do it if you want to. Don't do it if you don't want to. Do it internally. Do it huge, however works for you. For content notes, there will be a small discussion on the second last slide about the encampments and the clearing of them. And overall, some discussions around settler colonialism, ableism, and other systems of oppression and exile from community. And beyond that, if there's something else I can do to support your full participation here, including those online, please let us know. We'll make sure we're supported. Is that better? All right, there we go. Thank you. So good timing, because I'm about to quote Dr. Lindsay Eales. As Lindsay's repeatedly taught me, we do not have bodies, we are bodies. Our capacity for memory, deep learning, connection, and imagination, all of which I invite you to bring today, is deeply impacted by our embodied experiences, even and especially when attending online. So we invite the body and mind to transition into this space. Is your body as supported as you need? Feel free to come lie down in the front, walk around, move around, sit, stand, go to the bathroom, fidget, use tools, craft. All of these things are welcome. I invite you to see if your electronic notifications are where you want them to be. I won't be insulted if you answer a text. I hope I'm not the most important thing in your life today. Have you had this chance to stretch and breathe? This is a moment where I usually like to invite a movement practice. This one I learned from Lindsay and Nathan Faouz, where you turn around and look all the way behind you one direction. Turn around and look all the way around you in the other direction. Come back to center. Feel connected to the ground through your butt or your feet or however you connect to the ground. offer some warmth to some part of your body through friction, and then offer that to another part of your body. And what their work has taught me is what this ritual can do is it can help you feel grounded in the space. Looking behind you helps you know nothing's chasing you. It's a pretty early way to remind your brain that you're okay enough here to open your heart to learning. It's only now that we've made sure everyone has access and that we're actually present and in space would I like to turn to acknowledgement. So on screen, there's an image and quote from the Musqueam's Disability Futures Report. It has a silhouette of an elder sitting in front of a row of 4 teepees and below an evening prairie sky. I want to acknowledge that I'm an uninvited visitor today on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. I'm also visiting from Amiskwichi, Wiskaikan, what you might know as Edmonton, Alberta, in Treaty 6 territory. I've lived on those lands for almost all of my life. And kind of embarrassingly, only the last 10 years have I really started a process of trying to figure out what that means. What does it actually mean to be an uninvited guest or settler on someone's lands? And what are my obligations in relation to treaty? And part of that learning came in 2019 when I was part of a Disability Cultures and Futures collective led by Anishinaabe scholar Tricia McGuire Adams, as well as Cree leaders like Grand Chief Lilton Littlechild and Laurie Buffalo. Together, we drew on the wisdom of the community of 4 distinct Cree nations to guide us in how to engage in disability work on those lands. And to do that in a way that affirmed and listened to traditional teachings, that affirmed and listened to disabled people, that honored sovereignty and treaty, and that contribute to resurgence. And the following quote from that report for me is framing this conversation today. It's given in this report in the context of disability, but I would say if you want the teaching to do its work on you, I would suggest thinking about it in terms of whatever it is that you study, the people involved, the ideas, the colleagues, but also thinking about it in terms of the other kinds of paradigms and scholars you might bump up against, the other people in kinesiology or other fields, especially paradigms you might not play well with. If you really don't want to sleep tonight, think about this teaching and allow it to do its work in relation to things happening south of the border, things that may be impacting or challenging or threatening the communities and institutions and ideas that we may hold dear. And the quote is this: in the Nehiawak worldview, interconnectedness and responsibility concerning disability differs from Western understandings. In the Western understanding, there's a tendency to reduce something so we're no longer responsible. How can we maintain that distance? In the Nehiawak worldview, it is, how are we attached to this? How are we responsible to this? The intergenerational impacts of colonization cause disruption to aspects of this connection, responsibility, and reciprocity, what's known as the law of Wokotowin. Addressing these tensions includes an invitation to vulnerability, rooted in the notion that each of us must do the internal healing work. And a note here that they're not talking, the each of us is not just Indigenous folks here, it's any one of us who's invested in mutual flourishing, and I would argue probably survival on this planet over the next few decades. I feel like this is the heart of what I want to share. It's a bit of emergent work from various collaborative projects that I'm working on. And it's about how multidisciplinary kinesthetic knowledges and learning might help us in the vulnerable work of leaning into the tensions and the frictions of engaging across worldviews. That could be paradigms, different cultural worldviews, different ideologies, and how it might help us move towards better aligning our choices with our values and our aspirations for shared futures. In other words, how might kinesiologists help save the world? So we started with a welcome. We're next going to talk about alignment, invitations to embodied values, move to convening, where we talk about how to do that when we gather, and last to harmony, convening in and through conflict. I will really attempt to do this under time. So the first one, what they call axiological alignment, invitation to embodied values. So in my master's, I wrote this piece on axiology. basically talking about the field of adapted physical activity was really trying to help disabled people. But they were doing it this way that I kept coming up across where they actually, in almost everything they did, showed us that they actually devalued disabled people. And so there was this weird disconnect between what we wanted to do and what we held in our hearts and how we embodied those values. So I wrote that axiology is the often unexamined, unrecognized, or mistakenly universalized values that influence all of our decisions, personal, cultural, or disciplinary assumptions about what is good and bad, right and wrong, and more or less valuable, worthy, desirable, beautiful, and meaningful. It's the area of ethics, the area of aesthetics, that is beauty, humor. It's the area of spirituality and belief. There are 5 key points that animate this work for me throughout. It's like one of those lines that goes through everything I've ever done. The first is, values are culturally, personally, and somatically encoded. So dominant discourses, things like inspirational disability, for example, cultural and spiritual worldviews, and also your personal experiences, all encode the operating instructions of our valuation systems. And I'll say operating instructions comes from PhD candidate Nathan Victor Faus. They teach us what and who we should fear, what we should fight. They determine what's likely to activate us, what will feel like an itch or an ouch or a sigh or a yay in our system. They entrain us to certain others, what we pay attention to, shaping our senses of longing and belonging. Values-based operating instructions often impact our choices without our knowledge. So there's a whole bunch of work on this, but basically when our values are really well aligned to the cultural values, we often don't even notice their values. We just think of them as natural, as objective, as truth. And when we're experiencing activation, which we'll talk about later, we rely far more deeply on these encoded instructions. So we often, in those situations, tend to react, or we think in binaries, what is good and bad, instead of really having nuanced choice or decision-making. And recent research shows that when we're activated, we literally follow our gut and our heart. So they both have major functions in mood, learning, memory, healing, and decision-making. We don't all make it up here. Our bodies help us make decisions. The third point, and scholars will hate this, but value neutrality will not save us. In academia, we often attempt to combat this idea of this values-based biases in decision-making through things like value neutrality, procedural consistency, or methods like bracketing. And we try and distance ourselves here to help make this have less of an impact. And this is where we want to return to the words of the Musquichi's disability report, which reminds us that in Western worldviews, when there's something we care about, or there's something that worries us, our tendency is to reduce something so we're no longer responsible, so we can maintain that distance. And they would argue that's not actually what we want to do. Instead, how can we be responsible to the ways that our values coordinate our choices and power in any given relationship? Sorry. So the fourth point is values always coordinate power in a room, whether we bracket them or not. They make some acts, words, questions, and people legible as value neutral, common sense, or common interests, or even celebrated as disinterest. Professional disinterest, for example. While the words and actions of others come to be understood as value-laden, nonsensical, or special interest. This is why so many activist interventions are actually at the level of axiology. We have things like queer pride, piss on pity, deaf gain, black is beautiful, trans euphoria. These are axiological interventions. Okay, fifth. We can train kinesthetically in values alignment. We cannot simply recode these deeply laid kinds of ideas, these values, these operating instructions through conscious choice. There's a whole bunch of research on anti-bias training, especially around anti-Black racism, and it's pretty clear that it has very little impact on those kind of subconscious choices. Ideas are super important. They're important for recognizing and making choices about what we want to be in the world. They activate our imaginations about what's possible. But here I draw from my experience as an athlete. You can't read a book and become a great athlete. If you want to embody something, if you want to change what you're going to do, if you want to embody and enact it consistently and creatively and under pressure, I was a wheelchair basketball athlete, this takes deeply embodied training. And to be able to do this more fully, consistently, and explicitly, in this case, to want to inhabit and embody our values, we want to be able to do it in our research, our teaching, in our relationships to each other, in our parenting, my child's over in the corner, and with each other and with the lands we're on. That's going to take training. And that's why I'm really interested in the role of kinesiologists in this work. So convening. What does this actually mean? How do we do this? What are some of the forms of training? As a collaborator and a PhD candidate, Nathan Victor Faouz has taught me, these set of tools that have been made in various collaborations are all really helpful to do first as an internal practice. You learn them, you do them in yourself, you come to be able to recognize it, and only then can you start to do it in an interrelational way with other people. Like all kinds of practice, getting it right is trying to get it right is the opposite of actually learning something meaningful, right? Perfectionism will not get us there. It's a form of distancing. To be responsible to something is to be always learning, to be making mistakes, to be trying, to be accountable to those mistakes, to be willing to be surprised to what the other person's going on for them. So let's start practicing. So this one is courtesy of Lindsay Eels and Nathan Victor Faouz. They created this for a course they had on anti-pathologizing trauma-informed practice. And it's a way for folks to begin to recognize and name levels of activation in their body. They would then use this alongside some somatic activities. So there are ways that you can kind of create your own Rolodex, we like to call it in our community, of things that we can do when we feel activated that can help us support not only noticing where we are, but how we might move through it. So on screen, there are 5 colors. Red is moving very fast, activated. This is often what people think of as activation. Yellow, okay, you're fast moving, you're activated, but you may be welcoming of engagement still. Green, okay, this is the pocket. You're sharing synchronous time. You're in the window. Blue, you're slow moving. This is still a point of activation. And purple, very slow moving, activated. In blue, often you can be, with consent, helped into connect more in a space, but sometimes it involves some support from folks to help you get engaged and a lot of good access practice. So take a moment now just to check in for yourself of where you are on this space. You don't have to share it with anyone. Think about what it feels like in your body. I'm yellow, I'm kind of bubbling, my breath's a little fast. I'm excited, I'm trying to be on time, but wanting to engage. Important in this, and this is again something I've learned from Dr. Eels, is don't judge, just sense. There's no such thing as a good or bad state of activation. Right? All of these states are incredibly helpful. They prime us for important automated responses that help keep us safe. But activation, a very activated state is not an ideal state from which to engage with curiosity. To learn complex or unsettling things, to try out new skills. You ever had that where you're with someone you have a super crush on, they're like, oh, try doing this new athletic skill, like not a fun thing to do in that situation. To make care-filled relational choices, right? We can train in our capacity to do that from yellow or blue, but we're not naturally inclined to be able to be that open. I like to practice this anytime I'm scrolling social media. Right? It's like every single article that comes up, oh, that was red. There's a lot of red these days. But then to think about what are the things, touching a rock, looking behind me, bone pressure, feather pressure. What are the kinds of things that help me remember I am a body and allow me to come to a space maybe of yellow where I can start asking questions and thinking about things with a bit more open heart. Only then, if I'm doing internally, can then I bring it to a classroom. Or something like parenting, which is the most activated place to be doing this stuff in. One thing I found is when we do this tool in the classroom, Nathan and I taught a class together on how to bring disability justice work into our practice as APA practitioners or other kinesiologists. And what we would do is people would practice this on pretty light readings. And then when we got in some of the more challenging readings, what we found is folks doing this really helped them recognize that thing that we call fragility, and then we blame people for, is really a form of activation. And I find it happens far more often for people who are actually big-hearted. They want to, they care. Like, these aren't the people who don't care. These are people who care, right? And that activation of having this real care, then realizing that you're implicated in harm is what creates that sense of fragility. What we found is having practiced this tool is people were able to be like, ooh, super activated, not going to engage from here. Here's some things I can do. And they could find a way through to come to the work with much more generosity and generativity. And so these are the kinds of things we can use in classrooms that can really make a big difference. Value incantations. Anyone here love administrative meetings? Yeah, people laugh because often they're dry, we barely bring ourselves, people are checking their internet at the same time, their email, their social media. So value incantations really are a way to carve a space to act in a different way, to act in more values-aligned ways. They're written or adopted through a robust consensus. They offer overt statements of welcome and mutual evaluation. And the repetition of procedural supports for collectively enacting the values we've stated. And so here's an example. The University of Alberta's Council for Disability Cultures and Access, we meet monthly. We talk about a whole bunch of administrative stuff. But we begin each meeting with this incantation, which we co-wrote. We welcome you to bring as much of yourself into the space as you can consent to. We affirm and cherish deaf, disabled, and neurodivergent ways of being and doing. If someone identifies an access barrier, we stop. We address the barrier before we proceed. Please say your name before you speak to support those not engaging primarily through visuals. Wait until interpreters have finished for the Q&A so that deaf participants have equal opportunity. We welcome questions for clarification when folks use language or theories that others aren't familiar with. Wherever possible, we favor sustainability over false urgency, generativity over productivity, timelines and lifelines over deadlines. What I can tell you is it changes the way it feels in the space. And the people on the council say, like, this is the one meeting I look forward to all year because it's the one place I don't mask or the one place I feel like I bring my body. So we can change the way we engage together. Speaking about bringing yourself, the slide reads the Recreation Collective. This is the group that I've done a lot of my research with over the last 7 years. Below it is our primary research question, which is this. How can more of ourselves bring more of how can more of us bring more of ourselves more of the time? This quote comes from Lindsay Ills' dissertation from someone who's involved in it, a community collaborator named Dale Slang. And really for us, it sort of set up the thing not only about how can we do that in sport, we're researching this other thing, but how do we do that in our own research? How do we do that in our own spaces? There have been about a dozen scholars involved in this collective since its beginning, but currently it's led by Anishinaabe scholar Tricia McGuire-Adams, Black diaspora scholar Danielle Joseph, and myself. And there are two images on screen, both by Rachel Masheni, an Indigenous artist. And they're each for a different project I'm about to quote. So one is called We Become Gardens, Intersectional Methodologies for Mutual Flourishing. And the other's called Awakening to Elsewhere, Collectively Restoring Embodied Experiences of Belonging. Awakening begins with the following poem. Early risers trickle into the wood-paneled kitchen, eyes feasting on the writings we shared with each other. Whispered learnings, wonderings, and good mornings creep into the quiet. Awakenings, I see you. I want to know who you are. Spoons, cups, and questions rise to a cacophonous hum, pulling the rest of us from our beds. The morning sun pours warmth through the giant kitchen window, making shadow puppets of the ferns and pines outside. Late risers nestle ourselves into overflowing benches and conversations. The collective shifts mid-sentence, mid-slurp to make space. Somehow there's more than enough room. The days and years to follow fill themselves in much the same way, tenderly bumping elbows and stories. Miigwech for seeing me, for hearing me when I speak to you. This poem describes two core methodologies of our collective. The first is visiting, deep visiting. That's not the thing that happens before you start the agenda. That is actually the research. We cook for each other. We learn what each other's access needs are for what we like to eat. Not only what we can't eat, what we like to eat, what are culturally relevant foods. We learn how to create accessible space. We share our stories. We read each other's research. We work in deep ways so that we can have deep conversations. When you do that kind of work in close proximity, you start noticing the frictions, especially in deep intersectional communities. And so our second method is really tenderly bumping elbows and stories, leaning into and building the stamina for those moments of tension. In disability justice circles, we call this access friction, where when something someone needs is up in friction with someone else. And that friction can be wearing you down if you don't address it, but it's an incredibly generative force if we can actually think of it and lean into it and work with it. There are many ways to tenderly bump elbows and stories, but movement is a really important part of this. So one of the learnings we had early is, you know that thing when you're in intersectional space and people say, right now we're gonna center disability. And so everyone else and so I had the great opportunity to do a research creative project with Baraka De Saleh, my postdoc. He's a queer disabled Black dancer, performance artist. And he hates that. He's like, what am I gonna do, carve out some weird part of my body and throw it in the middle and somehow think my experiences of ableism can be separated from my experience of Blackness? And so he invited us into this movement practice where you take any part of your body, on your left elbow, and you put much as you can, all of your weight into it. And you move it around, allow it to guide your movement, and then notice how your right ankle moves when you do that. Notice what happens to your left shoulder. That's how we think intersectionally. If we're giving weight to disability in this conversation, then how does that move and shift the ways we think about settler colonialism? How does that allow us to think about the ways that, for example, deficit narratives and technologies like IQ tests and things like this have been used in order to construct particular groups of people as deficient, in order to, even now when we think about diabetes, in order to allow colonial engagement into Indigenous communities, right? It allows us to think differently about the whole body of the work. So again, movement allows us to think differently about these things. Another way to tenderly bump elbows and stories is through accountable kindness. I don't believe in safe spaces. We can't declare that for someone else, but also safe spaces are terrible learning spaces. Learning something pivotal in our life is always going to feel a little bit dangerous. Brave spaces are terrible, right? They put a lot of emphasis on a few people to be brave, and then usually we get exiled for doing it. But accountable spaces, I was starting to get into this, but noticing, first of all, in Western cultures, how often accountability gets to be known as the same thing as punishment, right? Again, often leading to exile. And secondly, it really often requires a kind of performance where you know ahead of time what your capacities will be at some future moment, and then you accurately do that thing that you predicted you could do, which is super ableist. And so when we came across accountable kindness, which is a quote from Danielle Heath Justice, there's something about it that really resonated for us. We can and must have the hard conversations if we have any hope of a better future, but still return to the conversations and to our relationships when we are done. In other words, we can hold each other to account as we hold each other up. In our community, we call this relational accountability. So any computer geeks here? No? Kinesiologists. So relational accountability is whether you can count on the links we've made to take us where we want to go. You know, when you click something and it goes somewhere. But if you think about that, counting on the links we've made to take us where we want to go. So for us, it's about collectively committing to working towards reliably, even if clumsily, enacting our values, and that our connections and trusts and relationships we build with each other will then take us where we need to go on our work. So how do we do that? Part of it is learning about what kinds of differences difference makes. So when we're spaced together, we need to learn about what the impacts of our words, our stories are on each other, on our actions, those sort of things. So we created this itch, ouch, sigh, yay protocol. This is a very long citational lineage. First came to us from Lindsay through Donna Michelle St. Bernard and Cold Alvis of the Ad Hoc Assembly, and then got added and changed and shifted through various configurations. But essentially, you can say these words out loud or you can use the emojis, but when you're having a conversation, anytime something comes up, you have that itchy feeling, like something doesn't quite feel right. I might not even know what that is. I'm happy for it to be addressed at a later moment. Cactus, that's it. Let's just name it. We can start a conversation. I said something like, something got blacklisted, and Janelle, it was like our first conversation. She's like, I got an itch there. I have no idea, but does that have a racist connotation? I feel like it might. You know, that started a conversation. Ouch, something feels wrong, hurtful, belittling, devaluing. I may not want to share about it. It's not my job, but we need to stop and we need to check in. That happens now. Sigh, I feel relief in my system at what's happening here. Rainbow. Yay, I feel energized, I'm happy, I'm excited. What you'll notice here is we're not only naming the microaggressions, but we're also naming the microaffirmations, the things that help each other feel like that connect with our values, that connect with the things we love in a space. And so this is a way to sort of learn about each other. Importantly, you don't just take this, put it into your 300-person class tomorrow when you're talking about trans sport engagement. You want to practice it first. And so Nathan, when they do some workshops, likes to do this. Just each time you practice 2 statements at the beginning to warm people up. Something that's a little contentious, but not super personal. So you can have this. So 2 examples of that are, pineapple does not belong on pizza. Any itches, ouches, sighs, yays? How about this one? Breakfast cereal is a form of cold soup. Gags, we need to add gags to this thing. But basically, this is a tool that can learn how we can learn about each other. And then when you do those little conversations, when the ouches come, we're prepared to have them. We have some experience with them. It builds trust. We can do, Lindsay, Nathan and I have a whole 3-hour thing about this. But just to give you a sense, when there are a lot of itches and ouches in a space and a lot of activation, we can use these invitations to imagination to do the work. So we can use aesthetic interventions. So we can support relationships to feeling, sensing, body, and beauty. We can use affirmation. So supporting relationships to sovereignty, belonging, interdependence, and value. We can use prefiguration, supporting relationship to situational stamina and long-range creativity. And we can use incantation, supporting relationship to generation and present-day value and inhibition. In habituation, not ambition. And a lot of the examples you see sort of draw on these 4 things. You see how many of these are embodied kind of actions. Okay, harmony. Okay, good. Convening in and through conflict. So it's super easy. It isn't actually easy, but it's one thing to do this with a bunch of friends who are all on the same page, who've all signed on to this protocol and want to hold hands and try and do it together. There's a lot of situations where the elbow bumping is not so tender. Anyone who's teaching a 100 level required class probably has this experience. But also, obviously, there's a lot of this going on right now. I'm from Alberta, you'll remember. And so how do we do this in a place of conflict? And this is the Olympics of values-aligned training and work. So Nathan and I both live profoundly intersectional lives in both overlapping and importantly, very different ways. We wrote the following together for a talk, a keynote we gave at the World Summit for Alternative Dispute Resolution that was about, instead of value neutrality, let's really think about what it would be to inhabit our values. So, open quote, "For many, our lives are unimaginable. Often people say they would rather be dead than be us. Often people believe that the world would be a better place if we weren't a part of it. Often when people, or even movements we believe in, imagine a future utopia, people like us are not in them. Often we must exile some part of ourselves so that we can be in community, even justice-oriented communities. Through pandemics, trans panics, anti-Islamic and anti-EDI discourse, this is constant. This has offered a kind of lifelong training in noticing when we as individuals or communities reach for the tools of fascism in the name of love and justice, reach for the metaphors and tactics of war in the name of creating peace. I do it too, all the time. To notice when we mobilize or even fantasize about solving our problems through tools like exile or punishment, pathologization, distancing ourselves, dehumanization, and control. I mean, how many times? There's only one right way to do this EDI, blah, 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 right? We do it to ourselves all the time. Exiling parts of our communities and parts of ourselves is a highly culturally normalized way to reduce ethical and social tensions we might feel, for which we have yet to develop sufficient stamina. And to once again quote the Musqueam's elders, right? We reduce something. We distance ourselves so we're no longer responsible. Instead, what might it mean to honor this tension and try to be responsible to it? So here we turn to the work of Anishinaabe scholar Aaron Mills. This is from his essay, "What is Treaty? A Contract on Contract and Mutual Aid." He writes, "Having no concept of autonomy to be violated, and thus no rights to be vindicated, the goal towards which Anishinaabe constitutional order strives isn't justice, it's harmony. Importantly, however, this isn't harmony in the romantic sense of non-conflict. This is harmony understood as the ceaselessly changing but grounded state of interdependent selves engaged with each other in personal practices of mutual aid, which we may call living in right relation, and that necessitates conflict." I found that quote incredibly uncomfortable when I read it, because I don't know about you, but I kind of live a world where I don't have to deal with conflict all the time. But if we take this seriously, if living in right relation necessitates conflict without exile, how do we train to hold the tension of dissent? And this list comes from the keynote that Nathan and I wrote. We need to first welcome tension as a vital energy, tenderly bumping elbows and shoulders. That friction, it's vital, it's generative, it creates things. We need to acknowledge that without dissent, there is no consent. If you cannot say no, you cannot say yes. We need to acknowledge that dissent allows us to invite consensus building with unlikely collaborators. So when a problem happens, we're sometimes forced out of the communities we would live in, and we get the opportunity to be at tables with people who may not think like us. And at that moment, we have the opportunity to transform something. We need to name the differential stakes and supports. So when we're in that 100 level class and we're talking about whether trans folks should be able to participate in women's sport, the stakes of that conversation are different for different people in that room, and we need to have the supports in that acknowledge and support that differentially. We need to acknowledge bodies, activation, feelings, needs. We like to have this like cognitive sport ethics class thing, but our bodies are engaged in this conversation. We need to acknowledge that, and we need to support bodies to be engaged in as open a way as possible. We need to anchor our conversation in underlying issues rather than strategies. This comes from alternative dispute resolution. right? We get really strategies attached, especially in equity work. This is the thing that's going to solve the world. Instead of thinking about what the issue that strategy is trying to solve, that's a meeting ground that we can meet at. Academic freedom is something that's touted by like everyone on all corners of the ideological spectrum. And then when we have control, we quickly try and stop the things the other person can say, right? We need to mobilize embodied techniques of imagination. Those are those things we're talking at the beginning. Imagining worlds, imagining, creating aesthetic and axiological interventions. And we need to note any relationship between strategies of forward motion and coercion. And here's where we go to the next tool, which is spectrums of consent. Okay. So this comes from Kai-Cheng Tom. On screen, there's a sort of waxing moon that goes from enduring, this is hurting me, but I don't feel able to say no, to tolerating, this is something I'm willing to put up with, willing, this is something I'm okay or neutral about, and wanting, this makes me feel good. Kai-Cheng Tong writes, consent is not a simplistic permission giving or the absence of no, or in medical terms like I consented them. Nor is it a third wave feminist model of consent as something that must constantly reach the almost impossible standard of enthusiastically informed, explicit, ongoing at all times. Both leave out a great deal of human experience. We choose to do a whole bunch of things that aren't just yes or no and that aren't in that full wanting, right? What's important about this is this allows us to recognize the degree to which consensus is often reached through the repeated endurance of some groups of people to support the willing and wanting of others, the differential stakes of the space, right? It gives us space for creativity and imagination. Where are degrees of freedom that we can, if you just have yeses and nos, it's hard, but when you have a spectrum, you can start to negotiate. But also, where are degrees of desire? This is where value comes in, where we actually harness what we actually desire and hope for to find actually places of wanting that mobilize wanting to do more together. Importantly, endurance here can be seen as the worst kind of consent, right? But endurance is also a superpower. This is also stamina, right? This is something that folks from equity communities experience a lot, and this is something we can train in. And if you can really work on that endurance, then there's a capacity to meet people you never imagined you could meet. You can be at tables building solutions that you never imagined there would be a common ground on. And if you can be at the same table, there's an opportunity to move from enduring to willing and wanting over time. So this is where the encampment clearing comes in. So we had all these great ideas, and of course they're drawn from a whole bunch of areas: abolitionism, somatic abolitionism, works on alternative dispute resolution, works on disability justice, this sort of work. And we're having all these great conversations, and then U of A, like many campuses, did an encampment clearing. So they brought in the police who forcibly cleared a very peaceful protest that was happening, that was protesting genocide in Gaza. And after this, there was a stalemate. So people just pulled this rope harder until the knot was so tight you couldn't do anything. These folks had very specific demands that were tied to strategy. You must do this thing or else. And on this side, we had folks who were like, our board or our province won't let us do this thing. And the rope keeps going. And worse on, the folks on this side were like, if you touch that rope, you're pro-genocide. And the folks on this side are like, if you touch that rope, you're anti-Semitic. And so a whole bunch of people just are stepping back, putting up their hands and not wanting to say anything. And so in a situation where the things we cared about, we can't move towards because everything is just stuck. And so the VP EDI at the time, Carrie Smith, called us up, a group of kinesiologists, and said, you know that funny things you're talking about? Pitch me something. Just pitch me something. And so a bunch of us got together. We put together a few ideas. We went and worked with the Vice Provost Indigenous Initiatives and some folks there to think about what a Cree approach to this would be. And then we worked with activists that we were deeply connected with and bureaucrats we'd had some trust with. And literally we had a week to come up with this. And we came up with the 6 pathways forward. What we did is under each of the activist demands, we tried to identify what was the underlying issue. And more than that, not only was it underlying that, what issue on this campus made this situation possible? Because it didn't start. There was no Black trans person on campus who was like, what? They called the cops and they weren't nice? Like, these issues predated this moment, right? And so we tried to figure out what are sort of issues-based things we could bring people in across campus for. And so the 6 pathways are holding harm, grief, imagination, and stories. So these were mutual aid grants to fund people to do the same kinds of teaching and so on that they were doing in the encampments, as well as to fund folks from BIPOC groups to bring in folks who could better hold the harm and trauma of what had happened. Transparency and accountability. The board's version of this was, okay, let's bring in this arm's length review. We were much more interested in a restorative approach. So we got the president to sign on to co-lead a program with 2 Palestinian scholars to bring in displaced scholars and students as a restorative approach to this. And they've been doing so ever since this was signed. Principles of responsible investment. You try and divest in a month, right? It's not actually easy. And a lot of people who are controlling those strings were not interested in being at the table. But we could make sure that all the information was out there by the end of summer, which we did. And we could create new policy that would require all future investments and so on to follow particular things. So we were able to get that done. Safety and policing, this is interesting. We actually got the decision-making pathway that people had. Instead of it being call the cops or don't call the cops, we're like, how do we maximize? So there's 5 or 6 choices at that point, not 2. And then how do we ensure that there's processes that need to be taken before the cops are called? And so we were able to do that in consultation with communities who are most over-policed. Freedom of expression we can't touch because it's a bargaining year, but we're getting there if we ever get a contract. And communications, our university had a process of neutrality. So they had that Western distancing thing, right? So we're not going to take sides. And so not only are we not going to talk about what's happening in Gaza, we're going to try and make sure no one else really talks about it because we want to be neutral. And then what we convinced them, and I know this is relevant to UBC right now, what's going on. What we convinced them about is to work for a multi-year training process with the Global Center of Pluralism, and to instead take a pluralism approach. So instead, how do we create university as a space that actually encourages, but also importantly supports conversations, difficult conversations across difference with dignity? How could that be something we get really good at? And so basically this was our approach, and it was not easy because I grew up in an activism where I kept just being like, but I want to grab the rope and pull it. But the kind of training and values alignment and the kind of stamina it takes to stay with the tension and go directly to the knot, that's the kind of training that led to this way forward. It got everyone back to the table. So I'm just going to end with this quote. This is one of my favorite quotes. Is by abolitionist activist Jairus Dixon. Everyone thinks kinesiology has nothing to do with activism, but it's interesting how often in social movements, like literally social movement, like the metaphor of movement is at the heart of what we're doing. And so I love this metaphor that Jairus brings in, which is, we must practice community safety as we would practice an instrument or a sport. By practicing in slow, measurable, and deliberate ways, we build the knowledge we need to diffuse and address conflict within our communities. So this kind of embodied and practice-based approach makes me believe that people in kinesiology of all subdisciplines and paradigms have a major role to play in building a world in which we can all survive and flourish together. And one way to train that potential is to practice bumping our paradigmatic elbows as often as humanly possible, but also as tenderly, as generatively, and as imaginatively as we can muster. Thank you. And thank you all for coming.
Really beautiful. And I think a lot of things we might want to be thinking about for a while.
Sorry.
I will open it up. We certainly welcome any questions or conversations for Danielle.
Thank you so much for this talk, Danielle. Trying to formulate my question because I feel like I have a lot of thoughts around this idea of bumping elbows. And I'm wondering how you grapple with positionality. And I think this connects to this idea of safe spaces and broad, brave spaces, which I dislike a lot because I think it tends to center those folks who are white, cisgendered, able-bodied folks who are living, who are like learning and less so those who are most impacted.
Yeah.
So how do you like grapple with that? And I think that really connects to abolition as well, right?
Yeah.
How do we divest from carceral logics, and how do we start thinking in a less punitive way?
Yeah. Which is hard to do. Right?
It is hard to do. So tell me more.
Yeah. And the punitive thing is exactly it, right? Like the president did this thing and everyone's like, oh, for the president's head, we need to be abolitionists. I'm like, wait a second. We can't use the very logic we're upset that they use. We're not just going to call a bigger police officer, but it's really hard to like divest ourselves from this kind of thinking. This was the whole reason for the Recreation Collective. So Tricia, Danielle, and I, when we all came out of programs in which we were the only ones like us, right? We didn't have, I didn't have disabled scholars on my committee. They didn't have racialized and Indigenous scholars supporting them. And so part of it was about mutual support, but also we were in that place where EDI was burgeoning and everyone wanted us to be on our grants, but then no one really wanted what we had to say, right? And so there are these spaces where we'd come in and be like, okay, well, and so we got really frustrated with this. We're like, well, how do we do this intersectional thing better? How do we do this differently? And so this is why we decided to we got an NFRF grant and we literally went to cabins and spent time, and we're like committed to reading a whole bunch of each other's work, and we committed to having conversations about our experience, and we drew maps about what were the ways in which our experiences came together and diverged and these sort of things. And I do think it's like training. You're not like, oh, I want to be a great, Nathan has this quote in their dissertation, which they often talk about, which is that we don't train to run a marathon. We train to become the kind of person who is capable of running a marathon, which is a different sort of thing. And so I think part of it was going together with these folks who are like, we're all going to make a whole bunch of mistakes, and we're going to have a process through which actually finding those mistakes and learning from them is the point of being together. And so we practice it in places that are relatively safe. The amount of times I was like, wow, I really brought a whole bunch of whiteness into that room and didn't realize it. And the painful times where we're on a walk and halfway through it ceases to be wheelchair accessible and they all need to move because we've all been sitting down and they keep walking and I turn around. What does it mean to come back after those moments of harm with enough trust to be able to say, this hurt, this sucks. What do we do with that instead of just trying to make it better or getting away from it? How do we actually learn what those frictions enable, and how to learn to hold each other with care? So I'd say this is the thing. We tend to be so urgent about the thing we want to solve that we come together and we try to go to the Olympics and we haven't even trained together. We haven't scrimmaged. We haven't created our capacity in the relationship. So this is what I would say is, as urgent as things are, there needs to be a stage at which we learn how to do the work together. And we do that at lower stakes. And once we build that trust, then we have the capacity of doing it at speed. And to make those mistakes in ways that we can trust, that there's a kind call-in, holding each other to account while we hold each other up. We're great at the account part. We're kind of terrible at the holding up part. And also, we train our capacity to hear that without allowing that fragility to take over. And so those are, I think, the two sides that train. I don't know if that helps. And I'm in the midst of it, so I don't know. But what I do agree with Dixon is the only way we can do this is to practice. And we can't always practice where the stakes are the highest possible place. And I fail a lot in my practice, to be clear. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
I do think this is what our sets of knowledges can offer to this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.